Walking the serpentine path, following the footsteps of the ancestors. Walking the serpentine path, making our way back home. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho, hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, ho. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho. Following the serpentine path. Life. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Serpentine Path podcast. My name is Claire Wowdy Yassid, and I'm a plant walker, song keeper, word weaver, artisana, visual and performance artist, womb wisdom keeper, and your guide on this serpentine path of life. Together, we'll dive deep into all things related to plant medicine, ancestral reconnection, intergenerational healing, womb sovereignty and bodily autonomy, rites of passage and initiation, time travel, shape-shifting, dimension hopping, the reclamation of our collective earth-based practices, and the ongoing, never-ending cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Welcome to the Serpentine Path, where the ancestors have called us back to. Let's start at the end and find our way back home together. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Serpentine Path podcast. I'm very excited today to have a beautiful, beautiful woman and friend and sister here on the show, Christiana. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really a gift and a blessing to be able to share this space with you. So, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome, Claire. I'm so happy to be here and very grateful for the opportunity to connect again with you.
Yeah, cool. So I'll start with this question that I've been offering to all of my guests, which is if your ancestors were here with us now, which of course they always are, how would they introduce you and what role would they say that you play in your family lineage?
Well, thank you for this question. It brings up a lot for me. They would certainly introduce me by my name. So my full name is Christiana Eva Schelfout. I'm the daughter of Irene Siobhan Costello and Paul Henry Schelfout. And I am a mixture of bloodlines and places. And I believe they would introduce me by they're calling me a carrier of stories. I really hold the stories of my family very deeply in my heart and feel very very blessed to be the daughter of such different kinds of people. And what's coming through now is likely introduce me as what came first was a way shower, but to me, in honesty, it's more someone who helps people remember what they likely knew, right? Which is the innate aliveness of everything around us and the magic that exists within the fabric of our everyday and the beautiful stories embedded in all which is living and existing, yeah, around us.
Beautiful. And I feel very similar about my role in my family when you said like the one who carries the stories and kind of the one who helps people remember. I think I feel similarly in my own lineage. And I think a lot of people, and particularly a lot of women who are drawn to the same things that you and I connect so deeply over, I think have that role in their family as well, of kind of what you said. Like, it's not even necessarily like teaching people something new, it's like awakening within them the remembering of how you described, like that aliveness that we are surrounded by and that we are like is our birthright actually at the end of the day. So yeah, anytime I ask people this question, I like always get really moved and like choked up and like teary-eyed because it's just so sweet and so special to feel your ancestors like come in when the question is asked and to witness them like moving through you and through your voice. So really honoring their presence here. Thank you to all of them behind you. Cool. Well, I'd love to share a little bit about how we met and how we connected just briefly, which is we met like almost 2 years ago, like a little bit less than 2 years when we were in Ecuador. And it was funny because you were like just leaving Ecuador and I had just gotten back to Ecuador. And we met at our friend Valeria's home. She was tattooing me. And that was a crazy time in my life. I got 5 big tattoos on my body in just 3 days, basically. And it was all of these master plant teachers that I had been working with for years, like my tobacco, the mushrooms. I got wachuma and peyote. I got the coca leaf. And then on my back, I had yahe, I have ayahuasca. And I think that you were there on the day that I was doing my coca leaf one.
I was there. I spent 2 nights at her apartment. So I think I was there. I don't know if I was there for all three, but at least two of your days.
I think so, yeah. The one that I had the most distinct memory of is the coca leaf one. And the coca leaf is like a plant that is used in ceremonies of like the sharing of the word and to move the word through with like sweetness. And I remember thinking about how sweet and kind and gentle and loving your voice was when it was coming through and all that you were sharing, and also how thoughtful and concise and clear you were in the choice of language that you were using to talk about some difficult moments that you were moving through in your life. And I really respected you. And I was younger at that point. I think it was only 25. And I was certainly looser with my words. I still can be sometimes, but it was something that I noticed in you that I was like, that's a sister who is conscious in the way in which her words land with people. And then after that, we never saw each other again. We've never seen each other in person since, but we did connect over Instagram, and all over and over again, I saw you posting things from people that I follow or like people that I wanted to learn from. The best example was like Rochelle Saliga. You reposted something from Innate Traditions, and I was like, oh my God, I love Rochelle. Like, I really want to do her training at some point. And you were like, oh, I did it. It was amazing. And I was like, wait, what? And then there was another one where I've been learning with Kidda Stache, who's actually going to be on the podcast. And you were like, are you doing sovereign cycles? And I was like, yeah. And you're like, oh, I did that. And I was like, she's done all of the all of the things that I love so much. Like, she's already done them because you're a few years older than me on your path, especially with womb wellness and womb wisdom keeping. And so it's always been so beautiful to see kind of an example of a woman who is moving on this path a few years ahead of me and how you carry that wisdom and teaching within you, and how you share, and also how you interweave all of your other offerings as well, particularly as a musician, because I'm also a musician, mostly a singer. And I also am, embracing more of like the beauty of technology in order to stay in touch with people. And you're one of those people. So I'm very grateful. And I'm grateful that there's so much that we connect over and that I'm able to learn from you and share with you. So thank you for always keeping that door open and your heart open to me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I receive your words with so much gratitude and love and just reflection, And one of the things I really admire about you, it's interesting, you're speaking about my word, is I feel you have this like courageous heart and a willingness to share. And I find that very admirable and something that I can also learn from. So thank you so much for the work you're doing with your podcast, the work you're doing online with your videos, with sharing and creating that space for women specifically, but all people to find you and to be a conduit of all the beautiful teachings you're receiving in your life.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, I'd love to give you some space to just talk about your life, your path, the work that you do in the world. Doesn't have to be linear. Talk about whatever you want. Who are you and what do you do?
I want to be really honest with our listeners today and with you that this question makes me feel so many things and can only most accurately be described as uncomfortable. And I've had the blessing of being on a few podcasts now, and so I'm in a process of learning how to like feel and drop down into my body and answer this question from a place of like ease and honesty and clarity. But my path begins as a child in Portugal. So I was very blessed to be born into a multicultural family. So my mother is from New York, second generation Irish, and my father is German and Dutch, but moved to Portugal when he was a baby. And so I grew up in a German American household here in southern Portugal and was largely cared for by my German grandmother, who was raised by her grandmother during World War II in Germany. And so there are various ties to lands where I haven't spent so much time. And one example being in my home here, we speak primarily German, though I've only been to Germany 3 times. And I speak like the German of a child from the 1970s, because that's when my grandmother left that place. And there's always been a sense of living inside of a story, living inside of a dream. And this place, I believe, has been a great enabler of that experience, which I'm very, very grateful for. I grew up in a home here. You can see a little bit in the background with a lot of artwork and old furniture and spaces that make you feel like you're living in a different place or a different time. And for that, I give so much thanks, because I believe it allowed me to, or gave birth to an imagination that wasn't scared to venture to different places. And so at age 7, I moved back to the US for the first time, and that was a wildly challenging experience because it came with a lot of turmoil on various levels, big T trauma, little T trauma. And then I was heavily medicated from the age of 7 to 18 for various psychological issues, one could say, quote unquote. But ultimately, I believe that those issues weren't issues at all. They were completely normal responses to a very challenging life situation. And they were a way to suppress the active imagination of a very curious child who had a connection with the unseen. So I was very blessed to go to a good high school. I went to a boarding school where I was close to nature, and that began to, yeah, to heal me, really. And by the age of 18, 19, I started to come off all the medication and started to understand once again who I was as me without the influence of these pharmaceuticals. And around that age, I was studying classical acting and performance art. So primarily classical Shakespeare. So it was a lot of studying of the English language. And I was very blessed because my training, although it was classical, it had a lot of elements of psychodrama, um, physical theater, really exploring the different ways our bodies and our minds and our voices can express and communicate. I'll always remember one class where we spent hours acting as our 3-year-old self. So having to embody the physicality of a child. And this was one of the greatest catalysts in my healing journey. Through this training, I discovered meditation and breath work and various other modalities, which would continue to weave their way through my life, though at the time I really had no idea what was happening. And then at age 20, I was introduced properly to the world of yoga, yogic philosophy, and began my path into meditation. And by 21, had gone to spend time living at an ashram and began experiencing what it was like to live in a monastic setting. And that set the stage for seeking out authentic and grounded ways of being, of understanding, and of navigating this beautiful and very strange and wild world we are living in. And so that was really the beginning of the path, which then led me to various places, different spiritual communities, primarily in Central America, South America, and in India. And I didn't have the intention at that time of sharing practices, but it organically happened. I started offering yoga classes and meditation to my community, so community donation based, and things moved from there. I had really wanted to be, well, at first an actress and a musician, and I was blessed to find work within the world of performance and music and song sharing. But the work through the healing arts is really what presented itself over and over again.
So beautiful. Thank you for sharing. And a few things, speaking about your experience of being like heavily medicated for all that time, I often think about how unbelievably lucky I was that I didn't end up being heavily medicated, because same as you, like I was that child that was like so connected to like beings of other realms, and also that child who had been through some really serious trauma. And there were members of my family who have been heavily medicated for the majority of their life. And I've always wondered, like, how is it possible that that wasn't my path, and like then having to go through all of the deprogramming that is required, not just like psychological deprogramming, but also literally like your brain having been on pharmaceuticals for a really, really long time and then like figuring that out. So just really honoring and respecting the unbelievably challenging process that that is. And I feel like we could do a whole episode on that. Maybe we will at some point. But then the other aspect that you were speaking of like art really coming in and being both art and nature, right? Like coming in and being the thing that brought you back online. And that has very much been the same thing for me. I'm actually like developing an entire course with a dear friend for the summer focused on that of like bringing women back to themselves, to their spirits based on creating. And the other thing that you touched on, which is hilarious because same story. I was a dancer, I was a performance artist, I did like acting and song and blah, 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 all this stuff. And I was living in New York City and was like, I'm going to be a star. And then I ended up on my like healer path and I was like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm a star. And it's funny how the deeper that women go into their creative practices and kind of shed the part of us that got into it because of ego and are able to go deeper into the layers of like, I'm creating because this is what is the most healing thing that I can do for myself and for the world, which is to like share my artistic gifts with the world. It then brings an even deeper layer of all of your art to unfold because it's coming from a totally different place. So it's not a surprise to me that that's kind of like where your path has taken you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so we met in Ecuador with this community called Hailima. I no longer spend time there for my own reasons, mostly just because I'm so deep in the jungle at this point. But we both are very deep into plant medicine work in our own ways and in our own paths. And something that you shared about, which is like what sparked, I guess, the inspiration for this interview, was that on Instagram a few months ago, you were talking about something that I had never heard about, which is hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. HPPD. You got it.
HPPD. And I DM'd you. I was like, "What is HPPD?" And you explained it, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, I totally had my own experiences with that." And I never knew that there was a word for it. And I remembered when we had met, you had shared a little bit about that experience that you had had just like a few months before, maybe like 6 months before. And I think it's something very, very common with people who work with any kind of mind altering substance. It doesn't necessarily have to be within like a ceremonial plant medicine context. But I think it would be really helpful, one, if I could hear like kind of the full expanse of your story. And I think it would be helpful for people to hear of like, this is what that is, this is what it looks like, and this is how I kind of brought myself back around to my center.
Mm-hmm. So the place that I feel inclined to start from is before even beginning to work with plant medicines. So as like a highly sensitive child or an adolescent, when I first started hearing about plant medicines as a teenager, I was very, or, psychedelics in general, I was very opposed personally, because I thought if I ever ingest anything like that, like I'm never coming back.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm already too open, too sensitive, and that would be a bad idea.
Yeah.
So when I was first stepping into the world of like spiritual community, I was spending time in India and Nepal, and I was doing a lot of work without the use of plants, right? So a lot of meditation. I was working with my sight, past life regression, and various other modalities that allow us to explore, kind of hone and refine our sensitivities to more subtle aspects of reality. And during that experience, I had one specific account where I felt like I had, quote unquote, lost myself, and it was difficult to come back into this reality. And there was this process of integrating what I had experienced once I came home, having really just been opened up to all of these different ways of seeing and understanding the world that couldn't be explained or easily communicated, and made my community or the people directly around me very uncomfortable, if I was trying to express, this experience I just had, which, in some ways was difficult and in other ways was like really magical, right? So, one of the things that I had explored during that time was living without contact lenses. So I wear like negative 4.0 contacts glasses. And so it's a significant, I'm like significantly visually impaired without them. Everything becomes a watercolor. And so I spent 2 entire months not wearing them at all, navigating life, and learning how to like perceive and feel what was around me without relying on my sight, but then also realizing with the help of other people that when my eyes were relaxed, I could see things which were happening, which were not so concrete, right? So beyond just like the physical material we have around us. And so that experience, and then coming back into the fabric of my everyday, gave me like an introduction into what it is to have like a very big experience where your understanding of reality is changed, and then come back into like, doing your taxes and, communicating with people who those kinds of conversations are just very unfamiliar to, or experiences are very unfamiliar to, and may have an inclination to pathologize what you've experienced. So when I started working with plant medicines, I found home. Yeah, I was like, oh, like it was like my fear, it was like the opposite came true. I thought it would open me up and I would never come back. And instead, I just like stepped into a place that I've always known. And I believe that's what many people experience. We hear that a lot. I'm sure you hear that as well. There's like this familiarity. It's like, oh, yeah, like, wow, I'm back here. And that provided a lot of comfort, a lot of comfort. And early on my path, I was exposed to one person specifically, but then more peripherally, who had really big experiences with medicine and weren't able to safely integrate themselves back into their everyday life. And I found this very moving because I felt a kinship with them. Like, oh, like it hasn't happened for me in this way, but I've always been like teetering on that line. And so I felt deeply inspired to begin extending myself, like by way of communication, contact, but also studies and trainings, to try to be of better service to community members who weren't able to quote unquote like get their feet back on the earth after these big experiences. And like we were just touching on prior to beginning the call, even just in preparation for this call today, it's opened up so many rabbit holes, so many like caverns of inquiry, which I will likely be exploring for the rest of my life in some capacity, because I don't think there is any, like with most things, there's not like an easy and direct answer or solution. Although there are some foundational things we can do, I believe we can do, in order to make these transitions between worlds, let's call it, right, or realities, better and easier on not only ourselves, but on our communities too, and those people who are supporting us. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have anything you want to comment there before I keep going?
Yeah, I'll just say, yeah, because I want to hear kind of like your experience of it when it did happen to you. But two things. One, I totally recognize that feeling of being like, I'm never going to come back, because I'm already so out there that like I would never come back. And after my very first time drinking yahe, it was so extreme and intense that when I came back down to earth, I was like, I would never want to stay out there forever. And then when I went back the next time to Colombia to drink, and there was a woman coming with me who said, I'm scared, I'm never going to come back. And I said to her, you are going to want to come back so bad that I promise you will. And the other thing about it, just like the way in which, like what you were saying of like the pathologizing of it, even not in a medicine context. Like I had a similar experience when I was 20. I had my first vision in a university class when I was like in undergrad, with a man just drumming. And I had a full on like vision that was as powerful as like any kind of plant medicine ceremony that I've ever been in. And integrating just that one vision took like years, and people thought I was batshit crazy. Like I had multiple people saying to me like never directly saying, but hinting that I was schizophrenic. And that really fucked me up. And even in the ways that I don't share a lot about my work with yahe anymore. I speak about it on general terms, but I never share like my visions or my pintas or like my relationship with the plant at this point, because so many people have called me crazy, either to my face or behind my back, or I just feel it in my field. And it's something that I think about often in terms of like what they say within a shamanic context is like a medicine carrier is someone who goes through the entire process of losing their mind and then finding it again. Yeah. And I think often about this one really hilarious experience that I had with my late and beloved teacher, Abuelo Keruin, where we were on the porch together. And we were not in ceremony. This was like 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. This man was just sitting there in his hammock, and he was talking, and I was beading. And at a certain point I was like, wait, is the abuelo talking to me? And I went over to him and I was like, abuelo, like, did you say something? Do you need something? And he like, he like looked at me, and it looked like he was like coming from one world, one reality, like into the reality that I was in. And he was like, no, don't worry. I'm just talking to the spirits. And in that moment, I was like, wow, what I needed my whole childhood, and what I needed, especially in my early 20s, when I was going through the experience that I went through of losing my mind, what I needed was an elder like that to be like, no, she's just talking to the spirit. She's fine. Gosh. And so I recognize the pain and the sadness and the loneliness that comes with the pathologizing of these kinds of experiences, whether it is through an altered state of consciousness that is not prompted by medicine, because people can have these altered states at any time, like how you've experienced, like how I've experienced. And then also with medicine, which I would say medicine can heighten it to a specific degree, which I think you'll probably touch on in your own story.
I'm so with you though. Wow. Like I wish if I had a grandfather who had just uttered those words to me as a child, my entire life would have been so different.
Yeah.
So different.
Yeah.
And feel like in my life, as far as my purpose is something I like, I want to be that woman to the children in my life and community who, present in that way to the world. But my personal experience with what the kind of conventional medical world is now calling HPPD was an experience with, well, there have been several smaller ones, but I really appreciate what I'd never heard that of like losing your mind and then finding it again, because that's essentially what had happened. I'd had a especially strong experience with ayahuasca. And in my experience, it was like all the different selves, all the different parts of myself were isolated from each other. And I didn't understand who the central I was. Who was I? Right? It was a question that I couldn't answer. And I give all of my thanks to yogic teaching and also the work specifically of Eckhart Tolle, who helped me a lot early on my path, because I came to remember that I am the observer, right? So all I have to do is observe, and that is where I find my I. And in that moment, I found that the I rests in the back of my skull, right where it connects to my spine. So I could place my attention there and be with the I. But once I left ceremony, this continued for over 2 weeks. And so during this time, I had to travel internationally. I had to show up and be present for my family through the holidays. And the entire time, it's a bit like you have a continuous mental stream, right? Like you have this internal dialogue, but there were several internal dialogues not happening simultaneously. But when one aspect of the dialogue would come up, it would isolate in a certain part of my consciousness or awareness. And then it was my work to understand where that came from. Right. So during this time, and now I want to be very clear here that I'm not making a recommendation to anybody who's going through a similar experience. I feel that's very important to say. I was really suffering. I felt, like I was going crazy and that I wasn't going to come back. Like this is how I was going to live the rest of my life. And if you haven't done work with or had a similar experience, it can be maybe difficult to imagine, but I can tell you with all my sincerity that it was like very, very challenging to function as a person, when you don't know who the I is, who the thinker is, right? And so I didn't call my spiritual family for help. And that's something that in hindsight, I was like, why? Like, why didn't I just pick up the phone and speak to somebody who knows a lot more than I do? And I can't give you a definitive answer for that. But what I did do was I continued to microdose with ayahuasca, and I continued to dream with her at night. And I put all of my trust in the medicine. And so it was like there was a split. Like I could choose to like panic or to pathologize or to label or to identify myself as crazy or whatever. Or I could just accept the fact that I was having an unpleasant experience, and I chose to lean into it fully. Say, okay, like I deeply trust in what's happening here, and I'm going to allow myself to be with it, to dream with it. I can always come back to my safe place, as the observer of all of these different thoughts or voices. And there was a very good conversation I had with my previous partner, where I was able to express myself, and in the expression of my situation, I no longer found myself living in isolation. And that is very important. I would recommend that to anybody. But the thing is here, you want to make sure it's somebody who can hold that, right? And I think that's where the work of psychedelic integration practitioners or other specialists, or simply people who have deep familiarity and relationship with these plants, is so vital. And then I integrated. I integrated everything back to a central I, and essentially like became whole again. And this was accompanied by, yeah, beautiful visitations. It was like a spider weaving a web in my mind and bringing everything back to center, what was coming through in the dreamscape. And so, what's interesting, what I believe might have happened if I had sought out conventional psychiatric help, would not necessarily have been very helpful, because what is likely is that I would have been pathologized, I would have been labeled. And the solutions presented for people who are experiencing what is being labeled through psychiatry as HPPD, while there are no like known, and I don't believe any like approved treatments, it's like sedatives, right? So I am ultimately very grateful for the experience, because when you go somewhere and you find your way back from that place, right, you learn the way, and then you can translate that way to others who come into your life. And I am also so grateful that I chose to trust in that moment. I chose to trust in everything that was happening, and chose to trust in the divine intelligence of the medicine.
Beautiful. Yeah, I really get it. My listeners already know I've been in like hundreds and hundreds of ceremonies at this point. When I was living in the jungle full time for like a year and a half, I was drinking usually 3 to 5 times a week, sometimes every night. And also with indigenous people who drink a lot and have strong medicine, and whose integration, like quote unquote integration process, is just their daily life. Like they show up at ceremony to their grandfather's house, like they're not going to some random person. They show up to their grandfather's house. They're drinking in a hammock next to their mom and dad. They drink, they have their last cup at like 2 or 3 in the morning. They sleep for a few hours. They wake up, they grab their machete, and they go out into the fields, and they just work. And they also don't talk about their visions ever. Like they don't explain their pintas with anyone in their family. It's a very like private thing. And it's just already kind of interwoven into the fabric of their culture. And so this is always a question that I have of like, when we are bringing outsiders into an indigenous context, an indigenous tradition of healing, because that's what a medicine ceremony is it is their form of traditional healing and traditional medicine. How do we support people in it? Because I know that I sure as fuck went really crazy a lot of the time and had to continuously find my way back. And there was not a single like plant medicine integrator around, or like psychedelic therapist around. Like it was just me with all of these elders who didn't want to hear anything about my visions. Like my integration was, I would show up to ceremony, or I would show up in the morning. The abuelo would say, how was last night? I'd say, good. He'd say, how many cups did you drink? I'd say, oh, 1, oh, 2, oh, 3. He'd say, did you puke or like purge? I'd say, yeah, or I'd say no. He'd say, did you sing? I'd say, yeah, or I'd say no. And then he'd be like, okay, go eat. And that was my integration. And what I found in myself were like various different tools of, like you said, how to find my way back. The biggest thing that supported me was through art, actually, was through learning how to bead with my beloved teacher, Abuela Maria, who passed away, Abuelo Kerwin's wife. She taught me how to bead and how to weave. And I was also drawing and I was painting and I was singing and I was dancing. And I was not like in my head and journaling and talking all the time and just constantly thinking about what happened. But I was like, okay, I had a vision. I have no idea how to explain it. People on Instagram are reporting me because they think that I am like going crazy. Like, oh yeah, that fully happened when I was like sharing about a lot of my experiences in the jungle. I was getting reported like every other day. People thought that I was batshit insane. And I was like, I have to find a way to work through this internally. And so I just started translating it through my art, right? And it's kind of that thing of like, I also understand why you didn't reach out to anyone, because at the end of the day, it was also something you had to figure out, like how you were going to navigate it yourself. And that's not to say that it's not important and not useful to have resources to reach out to, but to also recognize that no one can save you. You made that choice to sit in that ceremony. Like you made that choice to take that step in your relationship with that plant and to deepen into the trust that you did, right? And I think the last thing that I'll touch on before I move on to the next question is like, I remember asking the abuelo, like, what happens if someone has a really, really bad ceremony and they like lost their mind? And what the elders always say is like, they need a healing without any medicine. Like they need to receive care from a traditional doctor and practitioner to clear away any of like the what they would refer to as like negative spirits or energy. And then they need to keep drinking, but a small amount, which is exactly what you did by like microdosing. And it's that maintaining the trust
Mhm.
medicine. I've had my own experience where I was like, I'm
Yeah.
never drinking a cup of yahe again. Like, no shaman is ever going to give me a cup of medicine again. And then I had a shaman give me a very small cup, and it was actually exactly what I needed to let go of that fear and to move through it.
Yeah. Oftentimes it's like the way through, right? It's like the way in is the way out,
Yep.
right? Like where the medicine brought you there, the medicine's going to bring you out. And again, like, at least for me, this is not advice, but this is what I've understood from my own experience.
Yep.
And like the deepening of that trust has been absolutely imperative
Yeah.
on this journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, it was the same thing of like, there were so many times and still so many times when I'm like, this path with medicine is so hard and I cannot keep doing it. And then I show up to ceremony and I drink another cup and I'm like, it's literally fine. This is beautiful. Like I am okay. And my fear of kind of what you're talking about of not being able to find my way back, my fear that like my brain is fragile, my fear that I'm mentally ill, my fear that like everyone thinks I'm crazy, none of that is true. Like this is literally me just talking to God through the earth, which is God. So it's a beautiful thing. Well, something that we've talked about kind of in preparation for this call and something that connects in with our similar shared interests is the lack of nourishment that pretty much everyone has. I think we're both pretty deeply attuned to lack of female nourishment, particularly when it comes to women's health and when it comes to their reproductive health more specifically.
Mhm.
And so it's very applicable for just kind of any healing process, like the degree of malnourishment that we experience in our culture, because we're not taught how to eat to support ourselves, we're taught how to diet. And a thing that has come up a lot in our conversations is kind of this understanding that what would the term be, like mineral depletion or like would that be what it is, like the lack of or nutrient deficiency, there we go, the nutrient deficiencies that so many people in Western culture are actually showing up to ceremony with because of the lack of truly eating to support our bodies and the process that it's going to go to in a very extreme context of working with something like ayahuasca or wachuma or psilocybin or combo or any of that kind of stuff. And so I'm curious, you said like you kind of went down a big rabbit hole. What things have you found in terms of like the importance of minerals? And the one that I can think of that I'll just drop in real quick is like copper. Like when I learned that copper deficiency is like wildly present in people who are showing symptoms of what would be pathologized as schizophrenia, that like really stuff for me. I'll include some sources in the notes because people have called me out on this before. But things like that of like, how have you seen in yourself and maybe in other people and clients like the how that lack of nourishment in showing up to ceremony then makes it harder for them to like come back to their body.
Totally. So like there's so many different angles we can look at this from. And one that comes up for me is that a lot of people come to ceremony for a reason. And I believe a lot of the issues that people are facing are ultimately the result of malnourishment. And so what happens is people come because they're, dealing with like anxiety or depression, and they come to the plants, and then they have these beautiful and profound experiences where they can learn and come to understand a lot about themselves, their lives, what needs to happen for them to, be well. The process of ingesting plants, all herbs in itself, but specifically like plant medicines, can deplete mineral stores in the body, and then has the potential in certain cases to then worsen the psychological issue that somebody's experiencing. So then they can have this profound experience, but then ultimately not feel well or even feel worse afterwards. And so it's vital, I believe, if we're going to work with plants, to like really look at what our relationship is with food, what our relationship is with nourishment, like in a larger context, right? Not just like the food we're eating, but like how we nourish ourselves, how we care for ourselves and our bodies. Because those are the things that are going to help us like assimilate all of these teachings. And it's also, to me, it's an indicator, a sign of respect, because it's not like, oh, I'm just going to do this thing, and then all of these beautiful teachings and gifts that the plants give us kind of evaporate, potentially. Take all of that beauty, take all of that wisdom, bring it into the body, and then bring it into action and be catalysts for change. And we find a lot of people coming to plant medicine spaces following vegan or vegetarian diets. And then there's also, I understand, like diluted information online as far as like what an ayahuasca diet is, when in truth, all different peoples and communities who work with ayahuasca have different diets, have different protocols surrounding their medicine work. So there is no one, universal ayahuasca in this case, diet. And then also the physiology of somebody who's like living in an intact community in a vibrant ecosystem with ancestral foods is just wildly different than somebody who is living in a city, who's, been using a lot of pharmaceuticals, who's not eating nutrient-dense ancestral foods, etc. And so the needs of different individuals are going to vary. And so, in my opinion, it's part of our responsibility as people who are coming from, places like Europe or the US, who are not living in intact ancestral-based communities, to really understanding what our physiological needs are before entering into these spaces. So have to take responsibility for like who we are and where we are and the reality of our physiology, to not compromise ourselves or anybody else. The biggest thing we can look at is like our culture's obsession right now with like vegan and vegetarian diets, and like the belief system that somehow it's more spiritual. And what came to me or what I believe now, at least after 20 years of vegetarianism, 6 years of veganism, I've been eating meat for 5. Everything serves a purpose. I do believe that vegetarian diets serve a purpose. It's about what your purpose is and about understanding the repercussions for the choices we make and the consequences of the choices we make. And, if you're pursuing a monastic life and vegetarianism is in line with that, then that is like your free will, your choice to make, right? And if you're going to enter into spaces where you're working with plant medicines and you're coming in as a vegan or vegetarian in this day and age, be very careful, please, right? Because the nutrient density, the mineral density of these foods, and also the energetics of consuming animal products, like why, to me, they loop us into the circle of life and they ground us into the reality of life here on Earth. Mm-hmm. And I know I'm super curious about your experiences living in the jungle, because I remember you telling me you were harvesting chickens to eat, and that was like all very integrated into life there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's so funny because what you touched on is like, oh, the ayahuasca diet, and I have to do this and I have to do that. And what I would say is like the first time before I sat in ceremony, the elder that I was sitting with, who I no longer work with, what he said is it's actually less important to me what you give up, like what you cut out of your diet beforehand, rather than like what changes you make to your life after the fact. And so he was kind of like, if you want to come in here, like still on, tons of alcohol and drugs and eating whatever foods you want to eat and like whatever, like that's your choice, actually. You can do that. What matters more to me is what you experience in ceremony and what you decide, how you transition your relationship to nourishing yourself after the fact. And so I entered into it without someone being like super strict diet, like take this out, like none of this, none of that. I'm grateful for that. However, I was still very much like vegetarian, kind of more pescatarian for a long time. And when I was in the jungle, like at a certain point, my elders were like, you have to eat meat. Like you're getting way too thin, which is true. I was getting way too thin. And I was trying to eat like all the time. I was trying and I just couldn't keep food down because I was drinking so much. And they really were like, you need to eat chicken. And they would just like put a plate of chicken in front of me that they had just killed and were like, you have to eat this. And I would see taitas, like shamans, like eat a full plate of like meat, rice, beans, plantains, everything like an hour before ceremony. There was no like fasting, none of that. They were like, I'm going to eat because I have work to do. And what one of my elders would always say, he was like, I don't know why all of these people think when they show up here, because there were people who were like vegan raw diet or like totally vegetarian or whatever, who weren't eating any meat. They were just eating like fruit and like nuts. And the elders were just like, what? Like they were so confused. And these were the people who were going crazy. These were the people who were really struggling with medicine. And these elders, when I asked them, I was like, why is that person struggling so much when everyone else is fine? And they would always say, because they're not eating meat. Always. That was always their response. They were like, because they have to feed themselves, And I did find for myself that when I started heavily reintroducing meat into my diet and just animal products in general, the transformation that occurred within my work in ceremony deepened to a degree that I really didn't expect, because I was finally strong enough to like get through it and do it, And the other thing that you touched on, which is like reintegrating back into that circle of life, which is that I'm a human being that is interconnected with the plants and with the animals. And when you're living in an indigenous context where you have people who are taking care of the animals that they are then going to be killing later to make sancocho, there's such a different understanding of like the abuela would take care of those chickens all day, every day, and she loved them with her whole heart. And then at a certain point, it was time for them to return that care in the way of like being, have their head get cut off and thrown into a soup. Like, it's just how it goes. And so I would say that just
Mhm.
my time in the jungle and coming back to meat has been so healing of reintegrating myself, like what you said, back onto like, this is life on Earth. I'm on Earth. I'm not in the
Mhm.
cosmos. Like,
Totally. And that's ultimately the vegetarian diets, especially when we look at like the religious or spiritual reasons for partaking in the vegetarian diet often have to do with ideas of enlightenment, right? Or illumination, or ultimately leaving the body, leaving Earth. And oftentimes those traditions have a hierarchy, right? And Earth body is at the bottom. And here we're working with medicines of the earth. Like I'm not here to leave my body. I'm here to be fully present in my body, and I'm here to do work. And when I'm working with the plants, I'm not coming for I'm not coming to check out. I'm not coming to disassociate. I'm not coming to leave. I'm coming here to be in better relationship with life and all of her cycles. And that includes accepting the reality that life is contingent on life and death. So what one of like veganism is ultimately a lie, because when you come to learn and understand about farming practices, there's like the ideology and then there's the reality. And when you look at like what most vegans are eating, it's like monocrops. So if we're looking at like, if we want to like create a scale and measure out like how much life are you giving, how much life are you receive, or how much life are you taking, how much life are you giving, and you look at regenerative agricultural systems that integrate animals into their loop, right? Like you have one cow, like you're taking the life of this like one sacred cow, and it's feeding people like with an immense amount of nutrition. So it's just supplying people with an immense amount of nutrition. One life, and that one life has supplied so much life to the soil, right? It's returned through its like biological process of just existing on these grasslands, reinvigorated soil, given life to all of these beautiful all of the grasses, all plants that come up from it. Um, and so in some ways it's like we close it, we don't want to look, right? So it's like just because we don't have that the meat, the reality in front of us doesn't mean that we can somehow separate ourselves from the inevitable, right? Which is that life is contingent on life. Um, and so for me personally, coming out of 20 years of vegetarianism, 6 years of veganism, and coming to eat meat, it was like I felt this like profound intimacy with reality and what it meant to be a human on the earth. And that is it's just a profound gift, really. And I also recognize that a lot of these experiences that I've had where I felt like a little bit crazy or really struggled with my mental health, certainly the malnourishment played a role in that. Now I have the strength. Now I have the capacity to actually be a conduit of helpful change in the world. While as before, it was like ideological, it's like up here, like in the mind, like, and now it's actually like in my bones, in my blood, in my tissue, like let's make something happen.
Yeah, this is something that I got into in one of the previous episodes with my friend Anna, who I brought on specifically to talk about veganism, because I was never vegan, I was vegetarian.
Mhm.
And the disembodiment that is required. And I would say people might get upset with me for saying this, but I'm gonna go there, like the pure delusion that is required in order to convince yourself that you are fully here on earth when you're not partaking in a relationship of reciprocity with animal foods. And I think that it all
Mhm.
kind of ties back to something that I brought up in my like Q&A on Instagram this week of someone was asking me just about like nourishing the body and kind of something that you just said, which is the anxiety and the depression part. I struggled with anxiety and depression for the majority of my life, right? And it wasn't until I started eating animal food again, but also just eating consistently, like
Mhm.
eating enough food, eating often enough, and eating foods that are really nourishing to me, like animal fats, animal proteins, complex carbohydrates, like good quality fruits and vegetables, a whole foods diet. Guess what? My anxiety and my depression went away. Okay. And so then that's also a question that I always
Yeah.
have around pathologizing what's going on in the mind versus saying, like, let's take a look at how this person is waking up in the morning, taking like a big cold brew,
Mm.
like straight to the face, like within getting out of bed. They have no protein in their body. Their blood sugar is crashing. Their cortisol levels are just spiking all day, every day. And we're going to give them a Xanax. Yeah, we could go down that rabbit hole for a long time.
Yeah.
What I would love to kind of transition to as we're moving towards the end of this portion of our
Mm.
interview is touching on your work as a musician and particularly
Oh.
the work that you offer. I would say like as a medicine musician, right? I mean, you have your voice traverses through many different genres, but I would love to hear about how your voice has transformed through ceremony and what you
Mhm.
feel like your voice is a channel or a conduit for these days, both within your
Mm. Mm.
musical offerings, but also in the way that you're speaking and you're showing up in the world. Like, how is your song and your prayers coming forth these days?
Thank you so much for asking. It's interesting you asked that question in that way. I was just asked to perform a show in New York City, and I think it's for some, brand launch. And so you can find me in Malokas in Ecuador, and then in these like very um interesting spaces in New York, and especially on the east end of Long Island. And um there seems to be like two distinct branches of the way I'm finding myself out in the world singing, but it's all like a central heart, right? And so there are songs that have like kind of been come from me, and really they're like it's like storytelling, and I really feel like it comes from this vessel. And those are generally like the folk songs I sing. And they tell stories of yeah, of many different things. And those are what find their way to like, these events or whatever small shows that I'll play in that part of the world. And then the other space where I find myself inhabiting much more frequently, and where I enjoy being the most is really within the ceremonial space or the healing space. So also working with the healing frequency of sound in a therapeutic context is a big part of my life. And what I love most about that is there's a liberation there. And while I love like the stories that I carry and like the I, like that's fun. Like I'm really grateful to be me in this life. There is an immense amount of liberation in the dissolving of the I and what comes through in ceremony, especially when working with the plants, because then you're just a conduit for what is alive and what is moving through the space, or what the energy of the moment or what the plant wants to express. And that is like one of the most profound gifts I've been offered in this life, right? Is simply the ability to be a witness in those moments to what is moving through, and to be a conduit, and into that small way be helpful, be a helpful presence in a space. And I find it interesting sometimes traversing this, because people from like another segment of my life will be like, oh, what's happening with your music? Like, you haven't, released anything. And, are you still making music? And it's like, yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious if there'll be more of like a weaving of those two aspects of self, sides of self, to come together and centralize and crystallize, and kind of be birthed into the world in a new way. But I am very much a student of song, and have found that the songs have an incredible way of teaching us. They teach us about ourselves, they teach us about the world, and we can come to understand what's happening around us and within us through the conduit of song. And it is a great joy and pleasure to get to bring that to people too, to help them remember that they also have that capacity and that ability. And even in my own story, I was not always a good singer. I did not like come out of the womb like with people being like, oh, Christiana can sing. It was like quite the opposite for a long time. And I truly believe that every single person on this earth who has the capacity to make sound through their vocal cords can in fact sing. And whether or not those in your vicinity are enjoying the sound is not relevant to the sounds you are creating capacity to create and catalyze healing in your life and in your body.
Beautiful. Yeah, I can really understand the like, people ask me all the time about my music. I have a similar kind of like two different genres. Like I work very much with folk songs and storytelling, because that's really what folk songs are, right? And then my medicine music, which is also just storytelling as well. And folk songs in a way, right? I mean, that's what medicine songs are, the songs of a territory and the songs of a people and the songs of the ancestors moving through. And something I often think about is like, I would love to share my music on a wider scale. And also, there's something so intimate and private about what is channeled through you in a ceremonial context, as you were speaking about. And when you're able to move out of the I, like you said, and to move into like, what does this ceremony need right now to move through my voice in order to bring joy, in order to bring love, in order to bring reconnection to family, in order to remember that we carry all the medicine inside of us that we need. Like, what is it that just needs to be birthed, and to just open my mouth and let it come through? Sometimes I'm like, well, I don't know if I could ever record that. Like, I don't know.
Totally. And I really, I have a lot of admiration for artists that are able to translate sound in that way. Definitely. Fact.
Yeah. Wow. There's every time I do interviews, I'm like, there's so much more we could talk about, which I'm sure I'll have you on again at some point. Because we're gonna kind of transition into our like paywalled episode that's available on Substack, which you brought forth when we first got on here. And I was like, oh my God, people have to hear about this, which is this crazy like spell casting experience that you had at the gynecologist, which I know a lot of women can relate to, and I think is a story that's really impactful and important. But I'd love to give you the opportunity to share with how people can connect to you, how they can find you, any Instagram, Substack, email list, whatever you're doing in the world.
For sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I love writing newsletters. And so you can subscribe to my newsletter at animatehealing.com. And that's my central hub for all my work. You can link to music there, upcoming retreats. We host a beautiful ceremonial psilocybin retreat every year in Portugal. This year it's in June. And yeah, that's the best place to keep up to date with what's happening. I'm not too active on Instagram, but I'm there occasionally, and you can link to that from animatehealing.com.
Cool. I will be sure to put all of your info in the show notes so people can find you and everything. Thank you so much.